Cold CEO invites assistant as a joke, but when she walked in, silence took over the room. Evelyn Hart was used to being invisible, but never forgotten. She had spent her entire life slipping into rooms where people spoke over her, around her, but never to her. Yet, the day her mother was dragged out of a courtroom in handcuffs, Evelyn realized that silence had a sound. The sound of laughter from the rich, and the silence of powerlessness. And one boy watched it all. Nathan Cross. He was just a teenager back then, cold, unreadable, dressed in money and privilege. He never offered a word, not even a glance. Now, years later, that boy was her boss. He sat at the top of a tower built on arrogance, untouchable, feared, and adored. But nothing pierced the armor of a powerful man faster than a ghost from his past, wearing heels and holding her head high. Think back, has someone ever doubted you so deeply, that you quietly swore you'd rise beyond what they ever imagined? If this resonates, welcome to Mr. Nuel Stories, where drama meets redemption and ordinary people become unforgettable. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to the channel, because the next story could be yours. 14 years earlier, the courthouse smelled of old wood and broken dreams. 12-year-old Evelyn Hart sat in the back row, her small hands gripping the wooden bench until her knuckles turned white. The marble floor seemed to stretch endlessly, cold and unforgiving, reflecting the fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and clinical. Her mother, Lorraine Hart, stood at the defendant's table in a dress she'd borrowed from their neighbor, the only nice thing she owned having been sold weeks ago to pay for a lawyer they couldn't afford. Lorraine's shoulders shook with each sob, the sound echoing through the cavernous courtroom like a prayer no one wanted to hear. Guilty on all counts of embezzlement and theft, the judge's voice cut through the air like a blade. The gavel fell with the weight of a coffin lid. That's when Evelyn heard it, the soft, satisfied murmur from the front row. The Cross family sat there like royalty in their perfectly tailored clothes, their faces masks of cold disappointment and righteous vindication. Richard Cross, the patriarch, adjusted his gold cufflinks with the air of a man who had just watched justice served on a silver platter. His wife, Catherine, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that probably cost more than Lorraine's monthly rent, performing grief for the cameras, but her lips curved in the faintest smile. And there, between them, sat their son. Nathan Cross was 16, all sharp angles and expensive fabric. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his gray eyes distant and calculating. He looked like he'd been carved from the same marble as the courthouse floors, beautiful, cold, and utterly unmoved by the human tragedy unfolding before him. Evelyn watched him, hoping, praying, for some flicker of compassion, some acknowledgement that her mother was more than just a criminal in handcuffs. That she was a woman who had worked 18-hour days cleaning their mansion, who had scrubbed their toilets and polished their silver, who had sacrificed her dignity for minimum wage and zero respect. But Nathan's expression never changed. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his hands folded in his lap like he was sitting through a particularly boring lecture. When his eyes briefly swept the courtroom, they passed right over Evelyn as if she were invisible. As if she didn't exist. The bailiff stepped forward, and Lorraine's sobs became desperate, pleading. "Please, I have a daughter. She needs me. I only took the money because—" "Mrs. Hart," the judge interrupted, his voice weary. "The court has heard your circumstances. However, theft is theft, regardless of motivation." The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that would haunt Evelyn's dreams for years to come. As they led her mother away, Lorraine caught sight of her daughter and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Evelyn wanted to run to her, to throw her arms around her and promise everything would be okay. But her legs felt like concrete, and the space between them might as well have been an ocean. In the front row, she heard Catherine Cross whisper to her husband, "Well, I suppose that's what happens when people bite the hand that feeds them." Richard chuckled softly. "Perhaps this will serve as a lesson to the others." Nathan said nothing. He simply stood when his parents did, straightened his expensive jacket, and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. But Evelyn remained frozen in her seat long after everyone else had gone, staring at the empty defendant's table and making herself a promise that would shape the rest of her life. Never again would she be powerless. Never again would she be invisible. And someday, she would make them see her. The courtroom grew quiet except for the sound of her own breathing and the distant echo of footsteps in marble hallways. A janitor appeared with his mop and bucket, and Evelyn realized with bitter irony that even here, in this temple of justice, someone had to clean up the mess. She stood on unsteady legs and walked toward the door, her reflection fragmenting and reforming in the polished floor with each step. At 12 years old, Evelyn Hart learned that some people are born into rooms where their voices matter, and others are born to clean up after them. But she also learned something else that day, something that would burn in her chest like a coal, the difference between being invisible and being underestimated. And sometimes, that difference could change everything. The apartment they moved to after the trial had thin walls and thinner hope. It sat on the edge of town like an afterthought, a concrete box surrounded by others just like it, where dreams came to die quietly and without ceremony. The carpet was the color of old mustard, stained with stories no one wanted to tell, and the single window in the living room looked out onto a parking lot where broken streetlights cast everything in shadows. Evelyn learned to navigate this new world with the careful precision of someone walking through a minefield. At school, whispers followed her down hallways like ghosts. "That's the girl whose mom stole from the Crosses. My dad says her mother's a criminal. I heard they lived in the Cross mansion before she got arrested." The truth was always more complicated than the whispers, but truth was a luxury Evelyn couldn't afford. So she learned to make herself small, to slip into classrooms and take seats in the back, to eat lunch alone in empty hallways where the echoes of her own footsteps were the only company she needed. Her grades became her armor. Perfect test scores, flawless assignments, projects that made teachers pause and look at her with something approaching respect. If she couldn't be liked, she could be undeniable. If she couldn't have friends, she could have excellence. At home, Lorraine had become a different person. Prison had hollowed her out, leaving behind a woman who jumped at loud noises and spoke in whispers, as if the world were listening and waiting to punish her again. Finding work was nearly impossible. Background checks eliminated her from consideration before she even got through the door. They survived on food stamps and the occasional cleaning job Lorraine could pick up from people who either didn't know her history or didn't care. But those jobs were rare, and pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. Evelyn took her first job at 14, lying about her age to work the evening shift at a local diner. She served coffee to truckers and pie to insomniacs, saving every dollar she earned in a mason jar hidden under her mattress. College wasn't a dream, it was a necessity, a bridge to a world where her mother's mistakes couldn't follow her. "You don't have to do this, baby," Lorraine would say, watching her daughter count tips at the kitchen table. "You should be focusing on school, on being a kid." But Evelyn had stopped being a kid the day she watched her mother get handcuffed in front of a courtroom full of strangers. "We do what we have to do, Mom. That's what you taught me." The years blurred together in a haze of work and study and careful invisibility. Evelyn learned to move through the world like smoke, present but unnoticed, essential but unacknowledged. She perfected the art of being overlooked, of blending into backgrounds and listening to conversations that weren't meant for her. And she learned. She learned that power wasn't just about money, it was about perception. That confidence could be worn like makeup, carefully applied to hide the cracks beneath. That success was a language, and if she wanted to speak it fluently, she had to immerse herself completely. By the time she graduated high school, valedictorian, full scholarship to State University, Evelyn had transformed herself into something new. Not invisible, exactly, but selective about when and how she chose to be seen. College brought new challenges and new opportunities to perfect her craft. She studied business and psychology, understanding that knowledge was power, but understanding people was control. She watched her classmates, many of them from families like the Crosses, and learned their patterns, their weaknesses, their fears. She worked nights as a waitress, days as a temp, weekends as a tutor. Every dollar earned was another step away from that mustard-colored apartment, another layer of armor between her and the girl who had sat powerless in a courtroom. Her professors noticed her, recommended her for internships, wrote glowing letters of recommendation. But even their praise felt distant, clinical. Evelyn had learned too well how to keep people at arm's length, how to be respected without being known. The Cross name appeared occasionally in business journals and local newspapers. Nathan had graduated from an Ivy League school, was being groomed to take over his father's empire. Sometimes there were photos, charity galas, business conferences, society events. He looked older, sharper, more polished. But his eyes remained the same, cold and distant, looking through people rather than at them. Evelyn would study these photos with the focus of a general planning a war, memorizing details, analyzing angles. Not out of obsession, but out of necessity. Because deep down, she knew their paths would cross again someday. And when they did, she would be ready. Have you ever had to rebuild from nothing? To take the pieces of a broken life and forge them into something stronger? That's the thing about invisibility, it's not always a weakness. Sometimes it's the greatest advantage you can have, because no one sees you coming until it's too late. King is born. Nathan Cross had always known he would inherit an empire, but he had never expected it to happen with his father's blood still warm on the marble floor of their family estate. Richard Cross died at 58, his heart giving out during a heated board meeting over quarterly projections. One moment he was pounding his fist on the mahogany conference table, demanding answers about declining profit margins. The next, he was clutching his chest and gasping for air that wouldn't come. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. Power, it seemed, was not enough to negotiate with death. Nathan was 28 and in London, closing a deal that would have made his father proud, when the call came. He listened to his mother's hysterical sobbing through the phone with the same detached calm he brought to every crisis, analyzing the situation, calculating next steps, feeling nothing at all. "I'll be on the next flight," he told her, his voice steady as granite. "Nathan, I don't know what we're going to do," Catherine wept. "The company, the board, everything." "Mother." The single word cut through her panic like a blade. "I'll handle it." And he did. Within 72 hours of his father's funeral, Nathan Cross had assumed control of Cross Enterprises with the ruthless efficiency of a coup. Board members who had known him since childhood found themselves facing a stranger. Someone who looked like the boy they remembered but spoke with the authority of a king. He restructured departments, eliminated redundancies, and fired anyone who showed even a hint of disloyalty or incompetence. The business press called it surgical precision. Employees called it something else entirely. Under Richard's leadership, Cross Enterprises had been successful but stagnant, built on old money connections and inherited influence. Nathan transformed it into something else, a machine that generated profit with mathematical certainty and showed mercy to no one. He worked 18-hour days, slept 4 hours a night, and socialized only when it served a business purpose. Relationships were transactions, conversations were negotiations, and emotions were weaknesses to be eliminated. The media loved him for it. Forbes put him on their cover with the headline "The Ice King: How Nathan Cross Froze Out the Competition." Business Weekly called him the CEO who turned coldness into currency. The Wall Street Journal wrote a profile titled "The Anatomy of Ambition: Inside the Mind of America's Most Feared Executive." But it was the nickname that stuck, the Ice King. Nathan embraced it. If people wanted to fear him, let them. Fear was honest. Fear was reliable. Fear got results. His assistant, a series of them, actually, since none lasted more than 6 months, would arrange his schedule with military precision. Meetings were timed to the minute, phone calls were scheduled and monitored, and anyone who wasted his time was eliminated from future considerations. He lived in a penthouse that looked more like a museum than a home, all clean lines and expensive art that his decorator had chosen. He drove cars that cost more than most people's houses and wore suits that were tailored to mathematical perfection. But at night, when the city lights painted shadows on his bedroom walls, Nathan sometimes found himself thinking about that day in the courtroom 14 years earlier. Not about the woman who had stolen from them, he barely remembered her face. But about the sound. The sound of silence when power spoke. The sound of justice being served on marble floors. The sound of someone small and powerless being crushed by something larger and immovable. He had been 16 then, still young enough to feel something resembling conscience. But he had learned that day that conscience was a luxury the powerful couldn't afford. His father had taught him that in the car ride home. "Never show weakness, son," Richard had said, his voice measured and cold. "People like that woman, they're counting on your sympathy. They want you to feel guilty for what you've earned, for what your family has built. But guilt is just another word for manipulation." Nathan had nodded, absorbing the lesson like gospel. Now, 12 years later, sitting in his glass tower high above the city that had crowned him king, Nathan Cross understood the weight of his father's words. Cross Enterprises employed thousands of people, generated billions in revenue, and influenced markets across 3 continents. He was untouchable, unreachable, unbreakable, and utterly, completely alone. But loneliness, like conscience, was a luxury he couldn't afford. So he buried it beneath layers of success and silence, building walls so high that even he sometimes forgot what lay on the other side. The Ice King ruled from his throne of glass and steel, never knowing that somewhere in his own building, a ghost from his past was learning to become visible again. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony. Enters the lion's den. Evelyn Hart had walked past the Cross Enterprises building dozens of times before she ever set foot inside. It was impossible to avoid, a gleaming tower of steel and ambition that rose from the heart of the business district like a monument to everything she had sworn to surpass. 47 floors of power and influence, each window reflecting the city below like 1,000 watching eyes. She would stand across the street sometimes during her lunch breaks from her temp jobs, watching suited figures disappear into the building's marble lobby like offerings to some corporate god. The building seemed to pulse with its own energy, drawing in the successful and ambitious while keeping out everyone else. Someday, she would think, I'll walk through those doors as an equal, not a supplicant. She just never imagined it would happen the way it did. The opportunity came through a temp agency, a 3-month contract as a junior assistant in the executive operations department. The pay was decent, the hours were long, and the requirements were extensive. Bachelor's degree, minimum 3 years office experience, impeccable references, and the ability to work in a high-pressure, fast-paced environment. Evelyn met every qualification and then some. Her resume was a masterpiece of strategic editing. Evelyn Marie Hart, no mention of her mother, her address carefully chosen from a respectable neighborhood she could barely afford. Her references were professors and former supervisors who knew her work ethic but nothing of her history. The interview was conducted by Margaret Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who ran the executive floor with the efficiency of a Swiss watch. "You understand that this position requires absolute discretion?" Margaret asked, her fingers steepled across the mahogany desk. "Our executives handle sensitive information, and we expect complete confidentiality." "Of course," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "I understand the importance of maintaining professional boundaries." Margaret studied her for a long moment, as if trying to read the stories written in the lines around Evelyn's eyes. "You have excellent credentials. Perhaps overqualified for this position. Why are you interested in starting at this level?" Evelyn had prepared for this question. "I believe in earning my place, Ms. Chen. I'd rather prove my value from the ground up than coast on credentials alone." It was the right answer. Margaret smiled for the first time during the interview. "You start Monday." Walking into Cross Enterprises on her first day felt like entering a cathedral dedicated to capitalism. The lobby was all marble and glass, with abstract art that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Elevator music played softly as she rode to the 39th floor, where the executive operations department hummed with quiet efficiency. Her desk was positioned in the outer ring of cubicles, close enough to observe but far enough away to remain unnoticed. Perfect. She learned the rhythms of the office quickly. Who drank coffee at what times, which executives preferred email over phone calls, how to read the mood of a room from the way people held their shoulders. She was efficient, organized, and almost invisible in the way she moved through the space. It was during her second week that she first saw him. Nathan Cross walked past her desk at 8:17 a.m., moving with the purposeful stride of someone who owned not just the building but everything in it. He was taller than she remembered, his dark hair now touched with silver at the temples, his gray eyes focused on something beyond what ordinary people could see. He wore his power like a second skin, expensive suit perfectly tailored, posture that spoke of absolute confidence, an aura that made conversations stop and heads turn in his wake. He walked right past her desk without a glance. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her coffee cup. 14 years had passed since that day in the courtroom, but the boy she remembered was still there in the sharp line of his jaw, the calculating coldness of his gaze. She waited for some flicker of recognition, some indication that he remembered the girl who had watched her mother get dragged away in handcuffs. But there was nothing. She might as well have been furniture. Over the following weeks, Nathan passed her desk every morning at 8:17 a.m. and every evening around 7:30 p.m. He never varied his routine, never acknowledged her presence, never showed any sign that he saw her at all. Evelyn began to study him the way a scientist studies a specimen. She learned his patterns, his preferences, the way he interacted with different levels of staff. She watched him in meetings through glass conference room walls, noting how he commanded attention without raising his voice, how grown men and women competed for his approval like children seeking praise from a distant parent. She listened to the whispered conversations of other assistants. He fired Janet from accounting yesterday. No warning, no explanation. Did you hear what he said to the marketing director? I thought she was going to cry right there in the hallway. My friend in legal says he's impossible to work for. Goes through assistants like tissue paper. The Ice King, they called him. Untouchable, unreachable, unbreakable. But Evelyn had learned something important during her years of invisibility. Everyone had cracks if you knew where to look. And she was very, very good at looking. She began volunteering for additional projects, offering to help with tasks that would give her more exposure to executive-level operations. She stayed late, arrived early, and made herself indispensable in the quiet, unremarkable ways that powerful people never noticed. Until they did. Margaret Chen began relying on her for increasingly complex tasks. Other executives started requesting her specifically for their projects. She gained access to files, meetings, and conversations that most junior staff never saw. And through it all, Nathan Cross continued to walk past her desk twice a day without seeing her at all. But Evelyn saw him. She saw everything. The way he paused sometimes at his office window, staring out at the city below as if searching for something he couldn't name. The way his jaw tightened when board members challenged his decisions. The way he worked through lunch, through dinner, through weekends, as if stopping meant confronting something he couldn't bear to face. She saw the loneliness he wore like armor, the isolation he had chosen over vulnerability. And she began to understand that Nathan Cross had built himself a prison made of glass and steel, where he could see everything but touch nothing. Soon, very soon, she would give him a reason to see her. The executive conference room on the 47th floor was Nathan Cross's throne room, and Friday afternoons were when he held court. The space was designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city below, a table made from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood that cost more than most people's cars, and leather chairs so expensive they had their own insurance policies. Nathan sat at the head of the table like a king among courtiers, his perfectly pressed shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his platinum watch catching the afternoon light. The quarterly review had run long, as they always did, but he preferred these marathon sessions. They separated the committed from the comfortable, the essential from the expendable. Around the table sat his inner circle, Margaret Chen, sharp and efficient as always, David Rothschild, the CFO who spoke in numbers and thought in profit margins, Jessica Martinez, head of marketing, who could sell ice to Eskimos and make them grateful for the privilege. And Thomas Blackwood, his general counsel, who approached every conversation like it might end in litigation. The annual gala is 3 weeks away, Jessica was saying, scrolling through her tablet with the focus of a general planning a campaign. We've confirmed the venue, the catering, the entertainment. 500 of the city's most influential people, all in one room, all celebrating Cross Enterprises' record-breaking year. Nathan nodded absently, his attention drifting to the window where the city spread out below him like a chessboard. The gala was important, an opportunity to network, to solidify relationships, to remind everyone why Cross Enterprises dominated their respective markets. What about the after-party? David asked, loosening his tie as the day's stress finally caught up with him. That's where the real business gets done. Naturally, Jessica replied. The usual suspects, board members, key investors, department heads, plus selected VIP clients. Maybe 40 people total. Intimate enough for meaningful conversation, exclusive enough to make everyone feel special. Thomas chuckled, swirling the scotch he'd poured from Nathan's private bar. Nothing like manufactured exclusivity to make people feel important. It's not manufactured if it works, Nathan said, finally turning his attention back to the conversation. Perception is reality in this business. If they believe they're in an exclusive group, they act like they're in an exclusive group. Speaking of exclusive, David said with the loose-tongued confidence of someone who'd had one drink too many, I was thinking we should invite some of the support staff. You know, as a gesture of, what do they call it, corporate inclusivity. The room went quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that follows an unexpected joke in the middle of a serious conversation. Support staff? Margaret raised an eyebrow. David, darling, this isn't a company picnic. The after-party is for people who make decisions, not people who implement them. I know, David waved his hand dismissively. I'm not talking about everyone. But maybe. I don't know, that invisible assistant from operations? What's her name? Evelyn Hart, Margaret supplied automatically, then immediately looked like she regretted providing the information. Right, Hart. She's been working here, 3 months? Have any of you actually heard her speak? I mean, really speak, not just yes sir and right away ma'am. Jessica laughed, the sound sharp and artificial. Oh please, David. Next you'll want to invite the janitors. I'm serious, David insisted, though his grin suggested otherwise. I bet she wouldn't even show up. Some people are so intimidated by their betters that they don't know how to function in polite society. Thomas set down his glass with deliberate precision. You want to invite her as what, exactly? A social experiment? Why not? David's voice carried the cruel amusement of someone who had never been on the receiving end of his own jokes. Let's see if she even owns a dress that didn't come from a discount store. It would be educational. Nathan had been listening to this exchange with growing irritation, though his expression remained neutral. He recognized the tone in David's voice, the particular brand of malicious entertainment that came from having too much power and too little character. But there was something else, too. A memory, faint and unwelcome, of sitting in a different room 14 years ago, listening to similar laughter at someone else's expense. You want to invite her to mock her, Nathan said flatly. David's grin faltered slightly. I wouldn't put it that way. How would you put it? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Nathan's voice remained calm, but there was something beneath the surface that made everyone straighten in their chairs. I just think it would be interesting, David backtracked. To see how someone like that handles herself in that environment. Nathan stared at him for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It was not a warm smile. You know what, David? You're right. Let's invite her. The room relaxed slightly, but Margaret looked concerned. Nathan, are you sure? If she's not comfortable in that environment. Then she won't come, Nathan interrupted. People know their place, Margaret. They don't reach beyond their grasp unless they're foolish enough to believe they belong somewhere they don't. His words carried the finality of a judge's verdict, and the conversation moved on to other topics. But something had shifted in the room, a subtle change in atmosphere that no one could quite identify. As the meeting broke up and his executives filed out, Nathan remained seated, staring out at the city below. He thought about David's words, about invisible assistants and social experiments and people who knew their place. He thought about laughter in marble hallways and the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. "Send the invitation," he told Margaret as she paused at the door. "Let's see if she even shows up." But there was something in his voice that suggested he was asking a different question entirely. "Let's see if I remember correctly who she is." The invitation would be sent within the hour, a cream-colored card with elegant calligraphy that read, "Mr. Nathan Cross requests the pleasure of your company at the Cross Enterprises annual gala after party." It was signed with his name in bold, black ink, like a signature on a contract. Or a challenge thrown down like a gauntlet. "When did you decide you wouldn't be invisible anymore?" Was it a single moment of clarity, or did it build slowly, like water behind a dam, until the pressure became too much to contain? Evelyn stared at the invitation for 3 days before deciding what it meant. The cream-colored cardstock felt expensive between her fingers, the kind of paper that spoke of old money and older traditions. The calligraphy was perfect, each letter formed with the precision of someone who understood that presentation was power. "Mr. Nathan Cross requests the pleasure of your company at the Cross Enterprises annual gala after party. Black tie optional. Saturday, September 15th, 9 p.m. The Pinnacle Club." She had placed it on her kitchen table, the same wobbly table where she'd counted tips as a teenager, where she'd studied for college exams by lamplight, where she'd eaten countless dinners alone while her mother worked late. The invitation looked out of place there, like a diamond in a jewelry box made of cardboard. "It's a joke," she said aloud to her empty apartment. "A rich man's game." But even as she spoke the words, she knew she was lying to herself. It wasn't just a joke, it was a test. A chance to see if the invisible assistant would dare to show her face in a room full of people who had never learned her name. She could ignore it. Pretend she'd never received it. Show up to work on Monday and act like nothing had happened. That would be the safe choice, the smart choice. The invisible choice. Instead, she opened her laptop and began to research. The Pinnacle Club was exactly what its name suggested, the highest, most exclusive venue in the city. It occupied the top 3 floors of the Meridian Tower, with panoramic views and a membership list that read like a who's who of political and business elite. The kind of place where a single glass of wine cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. She studied photos from previous year's events, analyzing clothing, jewelry, conversation patterns. She watched these people like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture, noting the subtle signals of hierarchy and belonging. The women wore gowns that cost thousands, jewelry that required security escorts, smiles that had been perfected in finishing schools and charity galas. They moved through these spaces like dancers who had practiced the steps their entire lives. The men wore their power more subtly but no less obviously, watches that could fund small businesses, suits that were custom-tailored to mathematical perfection, handshakes that sealed deals worth millions. And at the center of it all, in every photo, was Nathan Cross. Taller than everyone else, commanding attention without seeming to seek it, surrounded by people who competed for his approval while pretending they didn't need it. "He's inviting me to watch him in his natural habitat **, Evelyn realized. To see the distance between his world and mine. The thought should have intimidated her. Instead, it made her smile. Saturday morning, she took the train to the city's fashion district. Not to the designer boutiques where women like Catherine Cross shopped, but to a small consignment store tucked between a bookshop and a coffee house. The owner, Mrs. Chen, no relation to Margaret, was a tiny woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper understanding of fashion. She had been dressing women on budgets for 30 years, finding ways to make $10 look like 1,000. "You need armor," Mrs. Chen said after Evelyn explained what she needed. "Something that says, 'I belong here,' without screaming, 'I'm trying too hard.'" They found it buried between a bridesmaid's dress and a cocktail gown someone had worn once and donated, a simple black dress in perfect condition, with clean lines and subtle elegance. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw unwanted attention. But when Evelyn tried it on, something transformed. This one, Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. Classic. Timeless. It makes them look at you, not what you're wearing. The alterations took 2 days. While she waited, Evelyn practiced, not walking in heels, she had mastered that years ago, but walking with confidence. There was a difference between moving through a space and owning it, between being present and being powerful. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror, studying her reflection like a general preparing for war. Her hair was pulled back in a simple updo, her makeup subtle but flawless. She wore her mother's locket, the only piece of jewelry Lorraine had kept when everything else was sold. It was a small silver heart, tarnished with age, with a photo inside of Evelyn as a child and her mother as a young woman. They were both smiling in the picture, caught in a moment of happiness that seemed to belong to different people entirely. Evelyn had worn it every day since her mother's death 2 years earlier, a heart attack at 54, brought on by years of stress and shame and struggles that had never quite ended. She wore it as a reminder, a talisman, a promise to the woman who had sacrificed everything for a daughter who had sworn to make it count. The dress fit perfectly. The heels were comfortable enough to last the evening. Her reflection looked back at her with steady eyes and a lifted chin. She looked, she realized, like someone who belonged. But more importantly, she looked like someone who knew exactly why she was there. The taxi ride to the Meridian Tower took 23 minutes through downtown traffic. Evelyn sat in the back seat, watching the city lights blur past the window, and thought about the girl who had sat in a courtroom 14 years ago, powerless and invisible and forgotten. That girl was gone. In her place sat a woman who had built herself from nothing, who had learned to navigate systems designed to exclude her, who had spent years preparing for a moment exactly like this. The taxi pulled up to the Meridian Tower's entrance, where valet attendants waited to open doors and doormen waited to judge the worthiness of each arrival. Evelyn paid the driver, tipped him generously, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the sense of expensive perfume and exhaust and possibility. She could see the Pinnacle Club's windows glowing 47 floors above, like stars she had decided to reach for. She walked through the marble lobby with the measured pace of someone who belonged there, past security guards who nodded respectfully, toward elevators that would carry her up to a world she had been born to challenge. In the elevator's mirrored walls, she caught sight of her reflection one final time. Her mother's locket gleamed at her throat, catching the light like a small beacon. "We made it this far, Mom," she whispered to the empty space. "Let's see how much further we can go." The elevator doors opened, and Evelyn Hart stepped into the light. The Pinnacle Club's main dining room was a cathedral of glass and gold, where conversations were conducted in low murmurs and laughter was rationed like vintage wine. 43 of the city's most powerful people moved through the space with the practiced ease of those born to such environments. Crystal glasses caught the light from chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes, while servers in perfect uniforms glided between clusters of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Nathan Cross stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city below, his reflection ghost-like against the backdrop of twinkling lights. He held a glass of aged Scotch, Macallan 25, the same brand his father had favored, but he hadn't taken a sip in 20 minutes. He was waiting, though he wouldn't have admitted it to himself. The room buzzed with the kind of conversations that shaped policy and moved markets. Mergers were discussed over champagne, political campaigns were funded between courses, and fortunes were made and lost in the spaces between sentences. "Nathan, darling," purred Vivian Ashworth, the socialite wife of a tech mogul, sliding up beside him with the practiced grace of a predator. "You look positively brooding tonight." "It's very mysterious." "I'm always mysterious, Vivian," Nathan replied without shifting his gaze from the window. "It's part of my charm." She laughed, the sound sharp and artificial. "Well, mystery is certainly better than that dreadful earnestness that's so fashionable these days." Speaking of which, did you hear about the Davidson acquisition? Absolutely scandalous how. Nathan's attention drifted away from Vivian's gossip as his eyes swept the room. David Rothschild was holding court near the bar, regaling a group of investors with some story that required increasingly elaborate hand gestures. Jessica Martinez worked the room like a campaign manager, collecting business cards and planting seeds for future opportunities. Margaret Chin stood near the entrance, her sharp eyes monitoring the flow of arrivals and departures with the focus of a security chief. She caught Nathan's glance and shook her head almost imperceptibly. Their little social experiment had failed to materialize. The invisible assistant had remained invisible. Nathan felt something that might have been disappointment, though he couldn't quite identify why. Perhaps he had been curious to see if his instincts about people were as sharp as he believed. Perhaps he had wanted to witness David's cruel little game play out to its inevitable conclusion. Or perhaps he had simply wanted to see if she would surprise him. Absolutely devastating for their stock price, Vivian was saying, her voice a persistent buzz in his ear. Of course, Richard always said that. The conversation in the room didn't stop all at once. It died in waves, like dominoes falling in slow motion. Nathan turned from the window, following the collective gaze of 43 powerful people toward the entrance, where Margaret Chin stood with her mouth slightly open and her usual composure completely shattered. And there, framed in the doorway like a portrait painted in black and silver, stood Evelyn Hart. The dress was simple. Deceptively so. Black fabric that moved like water, clean lines that spoke of elegant restraint rather than desperate attention-seeking. Her dark hair was pulled back to reveal the graceful line of her neck, where a small silver locket caught the light with each breath. But it wasn't the dress that commanded attention. It wasn't the way she carried herself, though she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in rooms like this. It was her eyes. Dark brown, steady, and utterly unafraid as they swept the room, cataloging faces and measuring reactions with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. She took in the crystal glasses and designer gowns, the oil paintings and imported marble, the shocked expressions and suspended conversations. And then her gaze found Nathan's. The moment stretched between them like a bridge across 14 years, carrying the weight of courtrooms and handcuffs, of silence and powerlessness, of promises made by a 12-year-old girl who had sworn she would never be invisible again. Nathan felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than memory. The woman standing in the doorway wasn't just his assistant, wasn't just another face in the crowd of people who worked in his building. She was the girl from the courtroom. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his vision narrow to a single point of focus. Evelyn Hart, the name that should have triggered recognition months ago but had been buried beneath layers of deliberate forgetfulness. Her mother had been Lorraine Hart. The woman who had cleaned their house, who had stolen from them, who had been dragged away in handcuffs while her daughter watched from the back row. And now that daughter stood in his exclusive club, wearing confidence like armor and meeting his stare with a steadiness that made his carefully constructed world feel suddenly fragile. The silence stretched on, weighted with tension that no one else in the room could fully understand. Servers froze mid-step, glasses paused halfway to lips, and conversations died unfinished as 43 powerful people waited to see what would happen next. Evelyn took a step into the room, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The sound seemed amplified in the silence, each step a declaration of intent. She didn't look around nervously or search for a friendly face. She didn't hover near the entrance or attempt to blend into the background. Instead, she walked deeper into the room with the measured pace of someone who had every right to be there. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the space. Not loud, but perfectly projected, trained by years of making herself heard in rooms that preferred her quiet. Margaret Chen was the first to recover, her professional instincts overriding her shock. "Ms. Hart," she managed, her voice slightly strained. "How lovely that you could join us." The words seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the room. Conversations resumed, though at a lower volume and with frequent glances toward the woman who had somehow transformed herself from invisible to undeniable. David Rothschild appeared at Nathan's elbow, his earlier bravado replaced by something that looked suspiciously like nervousness. "Well," he murmured, "I didn't expect. I mean, she actually..." "She actually what, David?" Nathan asked quietly, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's face as she accepted a glass of champagne from a server and engaged in polite conversation with the head of their legal department. "She actually looks like she belongs here," David finished weakly. Nathan watched as Evelyn moved through the room, her presence creating ripples in conversations, forcing acknowledgments from people who had perfected the art of selective blindness. She spoke with quiet intelligence, asked thoughtful questions, and listened with the kind of attention that made people feel like they were the only person in the room. She was, Nathan realized, everything these people pretended to be but weren't: genuinely interested in others, comfortable in her own skin, confident without being arrogant. She was magnificent. And she was here for a reason. As if sensing his thoughts, Evelyn's gaze found his again across the crowded room. This time, she smiled, not the practiced social smile of someone working a room, but something smaller and more personal. Something that suggested she knew exactly who he was, exactly what this moment meant, and exactly why she had chosen to be here tonight. The girl from the courtroom had grown up, and she had come to collect. The room that had fallen silent for Evelyn's entrance now hummed with a different energy, the electric tension of a social ecosystem recalibrating itself around an unexpected variable. Evelyn moved through the space with the fluid grace of someone who understood that power wasn't about demanding attention, but about earning it. She spoke with Thomas Blackwood about recent changes in corporate law, surprising him with insights that revealed she had been paying attention to far more than filing systems and coffee orders. "I hadn't considered the implications for smaller subsidiaries," Thomas admitted, swirling his brandy thoughtfully. "You raise an excellent point about the regulatory gaps." Near the bar, she engaged Dr. Sarah Chen, the renowned psychologist who served on Cross Enterprises' board, in a discussion about workplace dynamics that left the older woman looking genuinely impressed. "You have an interesting perspective on organizational behavior," Dr. Chen observed. "Have you considered pursuing graduate studies in the field?" "I believe in learning from observation," Evelyn replied, her eyes briefly scanning the room. "Some of the most valuable education happens outside traditional classrooms." But it was her conversation with Vincent Morrison, the legendary investor known for his ability to spot untapped potential, that truly caught Nathan's attention. "Most people in your position would be networking frantically," Morrison said, his pale eyes studying Evelyn with the focus of a hawk. "Collecting business cards, making connections, trying to leverage tonight into tomorrow's opportunities. But you're not doing any of that." Evelyn smiled, an expression that held depths Nathan was only beginning to recognize. "Perhaps I'm playing a longer game, Mr. Morrison." "Ah," Morrison chuckled, genuine delight creeping into his voice. "Now that's interesting. Tell me, what does the long game look like from your perspective?" "Success that can't be taken away," Evelyn replied without hesitation. "Built on foundation that can't be shaken." Morrison raised his glass in a small salute. "To unshakable foundations, then." Nathan watched these interactions with growing fascination and something that might have been unease. This wasn't the social experiment David had envisioned, some awkward display of someone trying to fit into a world beyond their reach. This was something else entirely. This was a woman who belonged. "She's quite remarkable," came a voice beside him. Nathan turned to find Margaret Chen, her usual composure restored but her eyes bright with curiosity. "You sound surprised," Nathan observed. "Not surprised, exactly. Intrigued." Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "In 3 months of working here, she's been nothing but efficient and professional. But tonight she's something more." "And what's that?" Margaret considered the question as they watched Evelyn decline a second glass of champagne while maintaining perfect engagement with her conversation partners. "Formidable." Across the room, David Rothschild was having what appeared to be an increasingly uncomfortable conversation with his wife, Elena, whose sharp eyes had been tracking Evelyn's progress through the room with the intensity of a social scientist. Darling, Elena was saying in a voice that carried just far enough to be overheard, you mentioned inviting some of the staff as what did you call it? A gesture of inclusivity? David's face had taken on a ruddy hue that had nothing to do with the expensive wine. It was just a thought. A lovely thought, Elena continued, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. Though I must say, your invisible assistant seems to be having quite the opposite effect. She's been the center of attention all evening. As if summoned by the conversation, Evelyn appeared at Nathan's side with the silent grace of someone who had mastered the art of strategic positioning. Mr. Cross, she said, her voice carrying the perfect balance of professional respect and personal confidence. Thank you for the invitation. It's been educational. Up close, Nathan could see details that the distance had obscured. The way her locket caught the light with each breath. The small scar on her left hand that spoke of childhood accidents or adult struggles. The steadiness in her dark eyes that suggested she had seen more of the world than most people twice her age. Educational, he repeated, genuinely curious about her perspective. It's fascinating to observe power dynamics in their natural habitat, Evelyn replied, her tone conversational but her words carrying weight. The way influence flows through social networks, how alliances form and dissolve, the subtle signals that determine hierarchy. You sound like an anthropologist studying a primitive culture, Nathan said, and was surprised to realize he was almost smiling. Not primitive, Evelyn corrected gently. Just different from what I'm used to. The words hung between them, loaded with implications that Nathan was only beginning to understand. This wasn't just his assistant making polite conversation at a company function. This was something else, a chess match, perhaps, where he was only now beginning to recognize the board. And what are you used to? He asked, though something deep in his memory suggested he already knew the answer. Evelyn's smile was soft but her eyes remained steady. Rooms where people have to fight for their voices to be heard. Where survival requires more than just being born into the right circumstances. The words weren't accusatory, but they carried the weight of lived experience that made the silk and crystal around them seem suddenly fragile. Nathan felt something shift in his chest, not guilt, exactly, but a recognition of distance he had never bothered to measure. You speak from experience, he observed. We all do, Evelyn replied. The difference is some of us remember where we came from. Before Nathan could respond, Jessica Martinez appeared with the urgent energy of someone managing a social crisis. Nathan, darling, I hate to interrupt, but Senator Williams just arrived and he's asking about the environmental initiative. You know how he feels about. Excuse me, Nathan said to Evelyn, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been regret. As he walked away to handle political necessities, Nathan found himself glancing back at the woman who had somehow transformed his exclusive after-party into something resembling a revelation. Evelyn Hart, the invisible assistant who had never been invisible at all, who had been watching and learning and preparing for exactly this moment. The girl from the courtroom had grown into someone who could hold her own in any room, with any crowd, against any odds. And for the first time in years, Nathan Cross found himself wondering what other assumptions about the world he might need to reconsider. The photograph was grainy and 14 years old, but it captured the moment with devastating clarity. Lorraine Hart in handcuffs, her face streaked with tears, being escorted from the courthouse by 2 deputies while a young girl watched from the background, her small fists clenched at her sides. The headline screamed from every newsstand in the city, "Criminal's daughter infiltrates Cross Enterprises," the shocking truth about Nathan Cross's mystery assistant. Nathan stared at the newspaper spread across his mahogany desk, his coffee growing cold as he read the article that had turned his Monday morning into a public relations nightmare. Sources close to Cross Enterprises confirmed that Evelyn Hart, the woman who made waves at Saturday night's exclusive after-party, is the daughter of convicted embezzler Lorraine Hart, who stole over $200,000 from the Cross family in 2009. The younger Hart, who has been employed as a junior assistant for 3 months, reportedly concealed her identity and criminal family history during the hiring process. The article went on to detail Lorraine's conviction, the family's financial losses, and speculation about Evelyn's motives for seeking employment at Cross Enterprises. It included quotes from unnamed company insiders expressing concern about security breaches and corporate espionage. Nathan's intercom buzzed. Sir, his current assistant, Patricia, or possibly Priscilla, he couldn't remember, sounded nervous. The board members are calling for an emergency meeting. And the reporters? No calls, Nathan cut her off. And no reporters. But even as he spoke, he could see the news vans gathering in the plaza below his office windows, their satellite dishes extended like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. His phone rang constantly. Reporters, board members, investors, all wanting answers to questions he wasn't sure how to ask himself. The worst part wasn't the media attention or the potential damage to the company's reputation. The worst part was the growing certainty that he should have remembered her from the beginning. Hart. The name had been right there on her employment paperwork, in her email signature, on the nameplate at her desk. How had he not made the connection? But even as he asked himself the question, Nathan knew the answer. He had trained himself not to see certain things, not to remember certain people. The help, the service staff, the invisible workers who made his world function, they were background noise, easily forgotten and rarely considered. Until now. By 10 a.m., the story had been picked up by 3 major news networks. By noon, it was trending on social media. By 2 p.m., Nathan's general counsel was fielding calls from reporters in 6 different cities. We need to address this, Thomas Blackwood said, pacing Nathan's office like a caged attorney. The board is panicking, the stock price is fluctuating, and every business journalist in the country wants a statement. What kind of statement? Nathan asked, his voice carefully neutral. Denying any knowledge of her background, expressing concern about the security breach, announcing her immediate termination, the usual crisis management protocol. Nathan's jaw tightened. And if I don't want to follow the usual protocol? Thomas stopped pacing. Nathan, I've known you since you were in diapers. Your father trusted me to guide this company through difficult times, and this is definitely one of those times. We throw her to the wolves, express shock and disappointment, and move on. It's the only rational response. Before Nathan could reply, Margaret Chin knocked and entered without waiting for permission. A breach of protocol that indicated just how serious the situation had become. The reporters are getting more aggressive, she reported. They're interviewing employees as they arrive, asking about company security, questioning whether we properly vet our staff. And sir. She paused, looking uncomfortable. What? Some of the executives are suggesting that Ms. Hart might have had ulterior motives for working here. They're questioning whether she might have been planning some kind of revenge scenario. Nathan felt something cold settle in his stomach. Revenge for what? For what happened to her mother, Margaret said quietly. For the family's role in her conviction and imprisonment. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic 47 floors below. Nathan stared out at the city, seeing not the present skyline but a memory of marble floors and clicking handcuffs and a small girl whose world had been destroyed by adult decisions and adult consequences. Where is she now? He asked. Miss Hart? She came in this morning as usual, but... Margaret hesitated. She's in her cubicle, working. Despite everything that's happening, she's just working. Something about that image, Evelyn sitting at her desk, calmly performing her duties while a media storm raged around her, struck Nathan as both admirable and heartbreaking. The board meeting is in 20 minutes, Thomas reminded him. They're expecting a decision about her employment status. Nathan nodded, still staring out the window. 20 minutes to decide the fate of someone whose life had already been shaped by his family's decisions. 20 minutes to choose between protecting his company and protecting someone who might not deserve protection. Or might deserve it more than anyone else in the building. Sir? Margaret prompted gently. Nathan turned from the window, his expression unreadable. Tell the board I'll be there in 15 minutes. And Margaret? Yes, sir? Ask Miss Hart to see me in my office. Now. As Margaret left to deliver his message, Nathan found himself wondering when exactly his carefully ordered world had become so complicated. And why, despite the chaos swirling around him, he felt more awake than he had in years. Have you ever had your past used against your future? Ever watched as choices you never made were held against you like evidence of crimes you never committed? Sometimes the truth is more dangerous than any lie, but it's also the only foundation strong enough to build a life on. Evelyn Hart had been preparing for this moment her entire adult life, though she had never imagined it would unfold quite like this. She sat across from Nathan Cross in his corner office, the city sprawling 47 floors below them like a kingdom he ruled from his glass throne. Between them lay the newspaper with its damning headline and grainy photograph, physical evidence of a past that had finally caught up with the present. Nathan studied her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had been missing crucial pieces. She met his gaze steadily, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight despite the weight of scrutiny that would have crushed someone with less resolve. "How long have you known," he asked finally, "that you were the boy from the courtroom?" Evelyn's voice was calm, professional. "From the moment I walked into this building 3 months ago." "And you didn't think to mention it? Would you have hired me if I had?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Nathan knew the answer, and they both knew he knew it. "Your mother stole from my family," Nathan said, his tone carefully neutral. "My mother made a desperate choice when faced with an impossible situation," Evelyn replied without flinching. "She was wrong to take the money. But she was also a single parent working 2 jobs for wages that barely covered rent, with a daughter who needed medical care she couldn't afford." Nathan's eyes sharpened. "Medical care? Asthma? Severe episodes that required emergency room visits we couldn't pay for. The medical bills were mounting, the collectors were calling, and my mother had already borrowed against everything she owned." Evelyn's voice remained steady, but Nathan caught the slight tightening around her eyes. She saw an opportunity and she took it. It was wrong, but it wasn't malicious. The courts didn't see it that way. The courts saw a poor woman who stole from a rich family. The narrative was simple, clean, satisfying. Justice was served. "And now you're here for what, revenge?" Evelyn's smile was sad and knowing. "Mr. Cross, if I wanted revenge, I would have taken it by now. I've had access to your files, your schedules, your private correspondence for 3 months. I've attended meetings where million-dollar deals were discussed, handled documents that contained sensitive information, organized systems that control significant portions of your business operations." Nathan realized she was right. If she had wanted to damage Cross Enterprises, she had been in a perfect position to do so. "Then why are you here?" "Because I wanted to prove something to myself," Evelyn said simply. "I wanted to know if I could succeed in a world that had written me off before I was old enough to defend myself. I wanted to see if merit could overcome prejudice, if talent could transcend background. And what have you learned? That some prejudices run deeper than others. But also that some people are capable of seeing beyond their assumptions." Before Nathan could respond, his office door opened and Thomas Blackwood entered with the purposeful stride of someone delivering an ultimatum. "Nathan, the board is assembled and they're not happy. We need a decision about." Thomas stopped short when he saw Evelyn. "Ah. Ms. Hart. I didn't realize you were here." "I asked her to come," Nathan said, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's face. "Well, that's convenient. Saves us the trouble of security having to escort her out." Thomas pulled out his phone. "I'll call down and have them prepare her termination paperwork." "No." The single word cut through Thomas's instructions like a blade. Both he and Evelyn looked at Nathan with surprise. "No?" Thomas repeated. "Ms. Hart stays." "Nathan, this isn't a decision you can make unilaterally. The board has serious concerns about." "The board can address their concerns to me," Nathan said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command. "Ms. Hart, would you join me for the board meeting?" Evelyn's composure flickered for the first time. "I don't think that's." I think it's exactly what's needed, Nathan interrupted, moving toward the door. If we're going to discuss your future with this company, you should be part of that conversation. The boardroom was a shrine to corporate power, its mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that had hosted decisions worth billions. 12 board members sat in their appointed places, their faces ranging from concerned to openly hostile. David Rothschild looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Margaret Chen appeared fascinated despite herself. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Margaret, observed everything with the clinical interest of someone studying group dynamics in their natural habitat. Nathan took his seat at the head of the table, while Evelyn remained standing near the door, her presence both invisible and impossible to ignore. Ladies and gentlemen, Nathan began, his voice carrying the authority that had built empires and toppled competitors. I'm sure you've all seen this morning's headlines. You're here because you believe we have a crisis that requires immediate action. Board member Harrison Wells, old money, older prejudices, cleared his throat aggressively. Nathan, this is hardly the time for speeches. This woman has infiltrated our company under false pretenses. She's the daughter of a convicted criminal who stole from your own family. The security implications alone are non-existent, Nathan interrupted. Ms. Hart has had access to sensitive information for 3 months. If she intended to harm this company, she would have done so already. That's not the point, snapped Victoria Sterling, whose family had made their fortune in railroads a century earlier and had been coasting on inherited influence ever since. The point is deception. She lied to get this job. Did she? Nathan turned to look at Evelyn. Ms. Hart, did you lie on your employment application? No, sir. Every piece of information I provided was accurate. Including your background check? I was never asked about my family's legal history. I was asked about my own criminal record, which is non-existent. Wells slammed his hand on the table. Semantics. She deliberately concealed relevant information. Information that was irrelevant to her job performance, Nathan replied coolly. Unless, of course, you're suggesting that a person should be held responsible for crimes they didn't commit. The room fell silent. Nathan could see the gears turning in board members' minds, the calculations of risk versus reward, public relations versus personal beliefs. Furthermore, Nathan continued, I'd like to address the elephant in the room. Ms. Hart's presence here isn't the problem. The problem is that we've been so insulated from the real world that we've forgotten what actual talent looks like when it doesn't come wrapped in privilege. He stood, his presence commanding even more attention. In 3 months, Ms. Hart has exceeded every performance metric for her position. She's improved efficiency in executive operations by 23%, identified cost-saving measures that have saved the company over $40,000, and demonstrated initiative and intelligence that most of you would kill to find in your own staff. Nathan, Thomas began. I'm not finished. Nathan's voice cut through the interruption like ice. You want to fire her because of who her mother was, not because of who she is. You want to punish her for a crime she didn't commit, a choice she didn't make, a past she couldn't control. He paused, letting his words sink in. 14 years ago, my family pressed charges against Lorraine Hart. We were within our legal rights to do so. But we never bothered to ask why a woman with no criminal history would risk everything to steal from us. We didn't care about her circumstances, her struggles, or her daughter who watched her mother get dragged away in handcuffs. The silence in the room was absolute. I was 16 then, Nathan continued. I didn't understand the weight of that moment, the power dynamics at play, the long-term consequences of our actions. But I understand them now. He turned to face Evelyn directly. Ms. Hart didn't come here for revenge. She came here to prove that she could succeed despite the circumstances we created for her. And she has succeeded. Brilliantly. Nathan looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. So here's what's going to happen. Ms. Hart will not be terminated. She will not be demoted or transferred or quietly encouraged to resign. Instead, she's being promoted to chief of staff, effective immediately, with a salary commensurate with her value to this organization. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and angry protests, but Nathan continued speaking over them. If anyone on this board has a problem with that decision, you're welcome to submit your resignation. But I won't sacrifice a valuable employee to protect the comfort of people who mistake prejudice for good judgment. He sat back down, his decision made and his position clear. Wells was the first to find his voice. This is madness, Nathan. The media will have a field day. Let them, Nathan replied. I'd rather be criticized for doing the right thing than praised for perpetuating injustice. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychologist, not the operations manager, cleared her throat. I move to support Mr. Cross's decision, she said quietly. Ms. Hart's performance speaks for itself, and her background is ultimately irrelevant to her professional capabilities. One by one, other board members began to voice their reluctant agreement. Not out of conviction, necessarily, but out of recognition that Nathan Cross was not a man whose mind could be changed once it was made up. When the vote was finally taken, it was unanimous, though several members' support came through gritted teeth. As the board filed out, Nathan remained seated, looking at Evelyn, who had watched the entire proceeding with remarkable composure. Chief of Staff, she said finally. You've earned it. This will cause problems for you. With the board, with the media, with Ms. Hart, Nathan interrupted gently. The problems started 14 years ago. Today, we finally have a chance to solve them. Evelyn nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a bridge built from shared recognition of past mistakes and future possibilities. Thank you, she said simply. Don't thank me yet, Nathan replied. Chief of Staff is a demanding position. You'll be working directly with me on strategic initiatives, major decisions, company direction. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? Evelyn's smile was steady and sure. Mr. Cross, I've been preparing for this my entire life. As she left his office to begin her new role, Nathan found himself wondering if redemption was always this complicated, this messy, this necessary. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. 6 months later, Cross Enterprises hummed with a different energy, one that visitors noticed immediately upon entering the gleaming lobby. The changes had been subtle at first. Response times to employee concerns improved. Interdepartmental communication became more efficient. The employee satisfaction surveys, which Nathan had never bothered to read before, showed marked improvements across every metric. But the real transformation was harder to quantify and impossible to ignore. Nathan Cross was no longer the Ice King. He walked through the office floors now, not just the executive suite. He knew the names of employees who had worked there for years without ever speaking to him directly. He attended company events not as an obligation but as someone genuinely interested in the people who made Cross Enterprises function. It's remarkable, Margaret Chen confided to Dr. Sarah Chen during one of their monthly lunch meetings. I've worked for 3 generations of Crosses, and I've never seen anything like it. What changed? Dr. Chen asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Margaret said simply. Evelyn changed everything. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. There had been resistance, from executives who preferred the old hierarchy, from board members who worried about appearances, from employees who had learned not to trust sudden changes in corporate culture. But Evelyn had approached the challenge with the same strategic patience she had applied to everything else in her life. She didn't demand immediate acceptance or force dramatic changes. Instead, she simply began doing the work that needed to be done. She instituted regular department meetings where employees could voice concerns without fear of retribution. She created mentorship programs that paired senior executives with junior staff from diverse backgrounds. She established a scholarship fund for children of Cross Enterprises employees who couldn't afford college. And she did it all while maintaining the high standards and exceptional performance that had earned her the position in the first place. The numbers don't lie, David Rothschild admitted during a quarterly review meeting, his earlier prejudices tempered by undeniable results. Productivity is up 18%, employee retention has improved dramatically, and our reputation surveys show the highest approval ratings in company history. Nathan listened to these reports with satisfaction, but his attention was focused on the woman sitting across from him, taking notes with the same careful precision she brought to everything. Evelyn had grown into her role as chief of staff with the natural authority of someone who understood that leadership was about service, not dominance. "There's something else," Jessica Martinez added, consulting her tablet. "The Harvard Business Review wants to do a feature story about our organizational transformation. They're calling it the Cross-Enterprises Renaissance and asking about the strategic decisions that led to such dramatic cultural changes." "What did you tell them?" Nathan asked. "That we'd consider it," Jessica replied. "But they're particularly interested in interviewing Ms. Hart about her role in the company's evolution." Nathan glanced at Evelyn, who looked remarkably composed for someone being offered the kind of national recognition that most executives spent decades trying to achieve. "What do you think?" he asked her. "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "that our success shouldn't be attributed to any one person. This company's transformation has been the result of collective effort and shared commitment to doing better." It was a diplomatic answer, but Nathan recognized the deeper truth behind it. Evelyn had learned early that visibility could be dangerous, that sometimes the most effective leaders were those who lifted others up rather than demanding attention for themselves. After the meeting, Nathan found himself alone with Evelyn in his office, reviewing quarterly projections and discussing strategic initiatives for the coming year. It had become their routine, these end-of-day conversations where they could speak freely about challenges and opportunities without the careful political positioning that formal meetings required. "The Harvard piece," Nathan said without preamble. "You should do it." Evelyn looked up from the financial reports she was studying. "I don't think that's wise." "Why not?" "Because this company's success story isn't about me overcoming my background. It's about cross-enterprises becoming the kind of place that values talent regardless of where it comes from." Nathan considered this. "And you don't think your story is part of that narrative?" "I think my story is a symptom, not the cause," Evelyn replied. "The real story is about a company that chose to evolve, that decided merit mattered more than pedigree." "A company, or a CEO?" Evelyn's smile was knowing. "Maybe both." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the city lights beginning to twinkle 47 floors below. Nathan found these moments oddly peaceful, a stark contrast to the isolation he had cultivated for so many years. "I have something for you," he said suddenly, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small wrapped package and set it on the desk between them. Evelyn looked at it with curious wariness. "What's the occasion?" "It's the anniversary of your promotion," Nathan said. 6 months since the board meeting that changed everything. Evelyn unwrapped the package carefully to reveal a small silver frame containing a newspaper clipping, not the tabloid story that had exposed her background, but a business journal article from the previous week titled "Cross Enterprises, a Case Study in Ethical Leadership." "Read the subtitle," Nathan said quietly. Evelyn's eyes found the smaller text below the headline, "How One Company Chose Values Over Prejudice and Transformed Its Industry." "This isn't about me," she said, though her voice carried a note of emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "No," Nathan agreed. "It's about us. About what we chose to become." Evelyn studied the article, her finger tracing the edge of the frame. "You know, 6 months ago, I thought success meant proving that I could survive in your world. But I think maybe I had it backwards." "How so?" "Maybe the real success was showing that your world could change too." Nathan found himself smiling, not the calculated expression he had perfected for business purposes, but something genuine and unguarded. "You know what the best part is," he said. "What's that?" "This is just the beginning." Outside, the city continued its restless dance of ambition and opportunity, but inside the glass tower that had once been a monument to isolation, two people who had started as strangers were building something new. Something that honored the past while refusing to be limited by it. Something that proved redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to choose it. The cemetery lay on the outskirts of town, where rolling hills met a sky that stretched endlessly in all directions. It was peaceful here, quiet except for the whisper of wind through old oak trees and the distant sound of birds calling to each other across the morning air. Evelyn Hart stood before a simple granite headstone, her promotion letter folded carefully in her hands like a prayer. Lorraine Marie Hart. Beloved mother. She did her best with what she had. 2 years had passed since her mother's funeral, but Evelyn still came here when she needed to think, to remember, to reconnect with the person who had shaped her into who she had become. Today felt different, though. Today felt like completion. We made it, Mom, she whispered, her voice carrying across the quiet space. We actually made it. She knelt and placed a fresh bouquet of daisies beside the headstone. Simple flowers, the kind Lorraine had loved because they grew wild and strong and didn't need much care to flourish. The promotion letter crinkled softly as she unfolded it, reading the words that had changed everything. Ms. Hart's exceptional performance, strategic insight, and leadership capabilities make her uniquely qualified for the position of Chief of Staff. Her appointment represents not just a recognition of her individual achievements, but a commitment to the values that will define Cross Enterprises moving forward. It was signed in Nathan Cross's bold handwriting, but beneath his signature was a note in smaller script, *, your mother would be proud. *. Evelyn had cried when she first read those words, not from sadness but from a joy so pure it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. You know what the strangest part is, she said aloud, speaking to the headstone as if Lorraine were sitting beside her. I thought I was angry at him all these years. At Nathan, at his family, at everything they represented. But I think maybe I was just angry at the unfairness of it all. A butterfly landed on the granite surface, its wings catching the morning light like stained glass. Evelyn watched it for a moment, remembering how her mother had always said butterflies were messages from people who loved you. The thing is, Mom, I understand now why you did what you did. When you're desperate, when you're watching your child suffer and you have no way to help, people make choices they never thought they'd make. The butterfly moved to the daisy bouquet, delicate and purposeful in its movements. But I also understand that just because someone makes a desperate choice doesn't mean there aren't consequences. And sometimes those consequences ripple out in ways no one expects. Evelyn stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and looked out across the cemetery toward the city skyline visible in the distance. Somewhere in that collection of glass and steel, Cross Enterprises continued its transformation, becoming something better than it had been. I think maybe that's what redemption really is, she continued, her voice stronger now. Not erasing the past, but finding a way to make something good grow from it. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package, a new silver locket, simple and elegant, with a picture of Lorraine inside and space for other memories yet to be made. As she fastened it around her neck, Evelyn felt the weight of her mother's original locket, the one she had worn to the gala, the one that had carried her through every important moment since Lorraine's death. 2 lockets now, 2 generations, 2 different kinds of strength. I know you worried about me, Mom. About whether I'd ever forgive, whether I'd ever let myself be happy, whether I'd spend my whole life fighting battles that were already over. The butterfly lifted from the flowers and circled once around Evelyn's head before disappearing into the morning sky. But I think maybe you'd be surprised by how things turned out. I didn't just survive in their world, I helped make it better. And Nathan, he's not the boy from the courtroom anymore. None of us are the same people we were back then. She folded the promotion letter carefully and slipped it into her purse, next to a business card that read, Evelyn Hart, Chief of Staff, Cross Enterprises. The scholarship fund we started? We're calling it the Lorraine Hart Memorial Scholarship for children whose parents work in service industries. Kids who might not otherwise get a chance to go to college, who might think their dreams are too big for their circumstances. Evelyn smiled, imagining her mother's reaction to having her name associated with educational opportunity rather than criminal conviction. And here's the thing that would make you laugh, Nathan's been working with me on expanding the program. He wants to make sure it reaches kids whose parents have criminal records, who face the same barriers we did. He says everyone deserves a second chance, even if they have to create it for themselves. A car pulled into the cemetery's parking area, and Evelyn turned to see a familiar figure stepping out of a black sedan. Nathan Cross walked toward her with the respectful pace of someone who understood the sanctity of grieving spaces. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said as he approached, his voice soft in the morning quiet. "Not at all," Evelyn replied. "I was just updating her on recent developments." Nathan nodded, his eyes taking in the simple headstone and fresh flowers. "May I?" He gestured toward the grave. "Of course." Nathan stood quietly for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back, before speaking to the headstone in a voice Evelyn had never heard him use, humble, regretful, honest. "Mrs. Hart, I never got the chance to apologize. For what my family put you through, for the circumstances that led to your desperate choice, for the way we failed to see your humanity when it mattered most." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I want you to know that your daughter has become an extraordinary woman. She's strong and wise and compassionate in ways that shame those of us who were born to easier circumstances." Evelyn felt tears she hadn't expected gathering in her eyes. "She's changed everything," Nathan continued. "Our company, our culture, our understanding of what leadership really means. And she's changed me too, in ways I'm still discovering." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single white rose, which he placed beside Evelyn's daisies. "Thank you," he said simply, "for raising someone who could teach the rest of us how to be better." They stood together in silence for several minutes, two people who had started as enemies and become something neither of them had expected, partners in the work of making amends for past mistakes and building something worthy of the future. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "She would have liked you, you know. The person you've become." "Do you think so?" "I know so. She always believed people could change if they really wanted to. She just never got the chance to see it happen very often." Nathan smiled, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe that's her legacy then. Giving people the chance to prove they can become better than they were." As they walked back toward their cars, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of complete peace with the past and genuine excitement about the future. The silence around them wasn't the silence of powerlessness anymore. It was the silence of promises kept, of justice served not through revenge but through transformation, of love that continued even after death. Her mother's locket caught the sunlight as they walked, a small beacon of hope carried forward into whatever came next. Behind them, the butterfly had returned to the granite headstone, its wings spread wide as if blessing the conversation that had just taken place between the living and the dead, between the past and the future, between forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. The city looked different from the 47th floor now, not like a kingdom to be conquered, but like a community to be served. Nathan Cross stood at his office window, watching the morning rush of people heading to work, each carrying their own stories of struggle and ambition, hope and disappointment. Somewhere in that moving tapestry were future leaders who didn't know their own potential, entrepreneurs who hadn't discovered their calling, innovators who were still learning to believe in themselves. A year ago, he would have seen them as resources to be utilized. Now he saw them as possibilities to be nurtured. "The final numbers are in," Evelyn said, entering the office with a tablet and the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just concluded a successful quarter. Employee satisfaction at an all-time high, productivity up 31% from last year, and retention rates that are making our competitors wonder what we're doing differently. "And what are we doing differently?" Nathan asked, though he knew the answer. "We're seeing people," Evelyn replied simply. "Really seeing them." It was a truth that had taken them both time to understand. Success wasn't just about profit margins and market share, though Cross Enterprises was achieving record numbers in both categories. Real success was about creating an environment where talent could flourish regardless of where it originated, where potential was recognized and nurtured, where mistakes were viewed as learning opportunities rather than reasons for dismissal. "The Patterson acquisition is moving forward," Evelyn continued, settling into the chair across from Nathan's desk. Their board was impressed with our company culture assessment. They said they'd never seen due diligence that included employee satisfaction metrics and community impact studies. Nathan smiled. A year ago, his acquisitions had been purely financial calculations. Now they considered human factors as carefully as profit projections, understanding that sustainable success required more than just sound economics. There's something else, Evelyn added, her tone shifting to something more personal. I got a call from the Harvard Business Review. They want to do a follow-up story about our transformation. Specifically, they want to profile what they're calling the Heart Effect, companies that are restructuring their cultures around principles of inclusion and opportunity. The Heart Effect? Nathan raised an eyebrow. I told them I didn't like the name, Evelyn said quickly. This isn't about me. No, Nathan interrupted gently. It's about what you represent. What we've all learned to represent. He turned from the window to face her directly. Do you know what I've realized over this past year? What's that? Invisibility was never your weakness. It was your superpower. You learned to see everything while being seen by no one. You studied power dynamics, human nature, organizational behavior, not from textbooks, but from lived experience. And when you finally chose to become visible, you had already mastered skills that most executives spend decades trying to develop. Evelyn considered this. Maybe that's the real lesson then. Sometimes being overlooked gives you the greatest advantage of all, the ability to truly understand what you're looking at. And sometimes, Nathan added, the people who have the most to offer are the ones who've had to fight hardest for the chance to offer it. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding that their partnership had evolved into something neither had expected. Not just professional collaboration, but genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to principles that transcended profit. You know what I keep thinking about? Evelyn said finally. What? That girl in the courtroom. 12 years old, watching her world fall apart, making promises to herself about never being powerless again. She paused, her fingers unconsciously touching the locket at her throat. I wonder what she would think if she could see us now. I think, Nathan said carefully, she would be proud that her pain led to something meaningful. That her mother's sacrifice wasn't in vain. That the powerlessness she felt that day eventually transformed into the power to lift others up. It was the truth they had both come to understand, that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about making it serve a purpose larger than the original wound. The intercom buzzed softly. Mr. Cross, the scholarship recipients are here for the award ceremony. Nathan and Evelyn exchanged a look of shared satisfaction. The Lorraine Hart Memorial Scholarship Program had grown beyond their initial vision, now providing educational opportunities for hundreds of young people whose circumstances might otherwise have limited their possibilities. We should go, Evelyn said, gathering her materials. As they prepared to leave the office, Nathan paused. Evelyn? Yes? Thank you. For seeing potential where others saw problems. For choosing transformation over revenge. For teaching an old dog new tricks. Evelyn's smile was radiant. Thank you for being willing to learn them. They walked toward the elevator together, two people who had discovered that the greatest success wasn't measured in dollars or power, but in the number of lives they could positively impact, the number of barriers they could help remove, the number of invisible people they could help become visible. Behind them, the city continued its endless dance of ambition and opportunity. But now it looked less like a battlefield and more like a garden, a place where the right conditions could help anything grow, no matter how small or overlooked it might have started. Your story matters. No matter how invisible you feel right now, no matter how many times you've been overlooked or underestimated, no matter what your past looks like or what obstacles stand in your way, your story has power. Evelyn Hart started as a 12-year-old girl watching her mother get handcuffs snapped around her wrists. She could have let that moment define her, could have let bitterness consume her, could have chosen revenge over redemption. Instead, she chose to build something better. She chose to see opportunity where others saw only obstacles. She chose to create value instead of demanding recognition. She chose to lift others up instead of tearing others down. And in doing so, she transformed not just her own life, but an entire organization, and everyone whose lives that organization touches. The greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's refusing to be forgotten. It's proving that your dreams are bigger than their prejudices, that your potential is greater than their limitations, that your story is more powerful than their assumptions. So what's your story? What dreams are you carrying that the world hasn't seen yet? What talents are you developing that no one has recognized? What obstacles are you transforming into advantages? Remember, sometimes being overlooked is the greatest gift you can receive, because it gives you time to become undeniable. If Evelyn's journey resonates with you, if you've ever felt invisible but refused to stay that way, if you believe that everyone deserves a chance to prove what they're capable of, please like this video, share your own story in the comments below, and subscribe to Mr. Nuel Stories for more tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Because the next story we tell might be yours. And trust me, the world is ready to see what you're capable of. Welcome to your moment. Make it count.